The room was dark, the kind of darkness that felt thick, almost oppressive. The air seemed to press against her skin, leaving her feeling more isolated than she had ever felt before. Emily stirred in her bed, a faint noise from the house breaking through the quiet of the night. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans that came with the old house settling into the evening, but something else, something deeper, more deliberate. Her eyes fluttered open, but the sleep still clung to her mind, leaving her hazy, her thoughts tangled in a web of a half-sleep. The bed felt too warm, too heavy, as if something was sitting on it. She turned her head slightly, trying to shake the strange feeling. There, in the far corner of the room, standing just beyond the edge of her bed, was a man. At first, it was as though her eyes couldn't fully comprehend what they were seeing. The figure was tall, too tall, and seemed to be draped in shadows. His silhouette was barely visible, but there was something about the way he stood, rigid and still, that sent a chill through her bones. Emily's heart began to race, the beat thumping loudly in her chest. The air felt colder now, and she drew the covers up tightly around her neck, as though they could shield her from whatever this was. She blinked, and the man was still there. His presence was undeniable, even if she couldn't make out his features. Just the shape of him in the corner of the room, motionless, was enough to make her blood run cold. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of her breath, shallow, fast, as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. But nothing made sense. He didn't belong here. She hadn't heard anyone come in. There was no reason for someone to be standing in her room just watching her like this. The man's figure remained unmoving, his presence somehow suffocating, as if he was waiting for something, waiting for her to do something. Her mind raced, trying to piece together explanations. Was it a dream? No, it couldn't be. It felt too real, too vivid. The coldness, the weight of his stare, it was as though he were solid, flesh and bone. Her eyes couldn't pull away from him, even as every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to scream for help. But all she could do was lie there, frozen in place, her breath growing more rapid as her chest tightened with panic. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, each moment more unbearable than the last. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. The man didn't move, he didn't speak, he just stood there in the corner of the room, and Emily felt her sanity beginning to unravel. In a desperate, almost robotic motion, she reached out for the lamp on her bedside table. Her fingers fumbled over the switch, but the light came on in a flash, casting a harsh glow over the room. And just like that, the man was gone. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Emily blinked, her eyes darting around the room in frantic disbelief. There was nothing. No man, no figure in the corner, just the room, exactly as it had been moments before. She couldn't understand what had happened. Was it a hallucination? Had she been dreaming? She tried to calm herself, to convince herself that it had just been her imagination playing tricks on her in the dark. But the terror that still clung to her, the overwhelming sense of wrongness, wouldn't let her go. She sat up in bed, the light from the lamp casting long, sharp shadows on the walls, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The weight of the room seemed to press down harder on her, suffocating her with the air of something unseen, something sinister. As the minutes passed, the sense of unease began to fade slowly, but Emily couldn't forget the vision of the man standing in the corner. She pulled the covers tighter around herself, trying to shut out the creeping sensation that he might still be there, hidden in the darkness watching her. But the night passed without incident. The man never returned, and the house was still, as it always was. But the feeling lingered, haunting the edges of her mind. She didn't tell anyone. How could she? What could she say? No one would believe her. And besides, she told herself, it was probably just a figment of her tired mind, a product of her overactive imagination and the weight of stress. Nothing more. The next night, Emily was once again lying in bed, staring into the dark, trying to quiet the erratic beating of her heart. The house was as silent as before, and yet her mind couldn't quite shake the memory of the man in the corner. She shifted uncomfortably under the covers, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows, as though she expected to see him again. Time seemed to drag on, each minute stretching longer than the last. It was just past midnight, and the stillness of the room was unnerving. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing unease in her chest, when suddenly she felt it again. That same cold, suffocating sensation, the presence of something in the room with her. It wasn't just the dark, the night. No, this was different. It was tangible. She could almost feel it pressing against her skin. Her eyes flew open, heart pounding in her chest. And there, in the far corner of the room, was the man again. This time, though, he wasn't standing motionless. He was closer, much closer. The space between them, which had been so vast the night before, had shrunk significantly. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, and she instinctively pulled the covers up to her chin, wishing she could disappear into them. The man was standing at the foot of the bed now, much nearer than before, his silhouette still hard to make out in the dim light from the lamp. But this time, there was something different, a subtle shift in the air, a feeling. It was almost as if he were watching her with a purpose, a deliberate intent. And then she saw it, a small movement, a twitch just enough to catch her eye. His head tilted slightly, almost as if he were smiling. Emily's stomach dropped, a wave of nausea rushing over her. Her hands gripped the sheet so tightly her knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening again. But there he was, standing at the foot of her bed, closer now, his presence more imposing than ever. And that smile, it was wide and unsettling, stretching across his face, distorting the shadows around him. Her body froze, her mind scrambling for any logical explanation. But none came. Nothing made sense anymore. She wanted to scream, to turn on the light, but her body wouldn't obey. The fear that gripped her was paralyzing, more suffocating than ever before. She couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of the room, but she was trapped, frozen in place by the cold, silent gaze of the man who seemed to have no purpose other than to stand there and smile. As her eyes locked with his, she felt a sharp, overwhelming sense of dread crawl under her skin. There was nothing human about that smile. It was wide, grotesque, unnatural, like something that shouldn't belong. The longer she stared at it, the more it seemed to stretch, as though it was growing, expanding into something monstrous. The corners of the room felt darker now, the shadows pressing in, suffocating her with their weight. The man's smile only grew until it seemed to consume his entire face, his features distorted into something unrecognizable. And then Just as her chest felt like it might burst from the pressure, the figure stepped forward, closing the gap between them. The light flickered once, and the man vanished. The morning came too quickly, the pale light creeping in through the curtains, slicing through the heavy shadows that had filled the room during the night. Emily woke up with a jolt, her breath still erratic from the events of the previous night. She lay still, her eyes wide, trying to convince herself that it had all been a nightmare. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, the remnants of the fear gripping her body. She blinked several times, letting the daylight seep into her vision. The room was empty, quiet, safe, or at least it seemed that way. There was no sign of the man, no strange figure standing in the corner. She sat up, wiping her hands over her face, her skin cold with the residue of terror. Was it possible that she had imagined it? Maybe she had. Maybe the stress from work, the long hours, the lack of sleep, maybe all of that had just caught up with her. She took a few deep breaths, trying to calm herself, convincing herself that it wasn't real. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The events of the night before were still fresh in her mind, a vivid picture painted against the backdrop of her panic. She couldn't dismiss it so easily. That man, he had been standing in her room, watching her. She shuddered, pulling the covers tighter around her, suddenly feeling cold despite the warmth of the morning sun. It wasn't just the shadows, the dark corners of her room that felt oppressive. It was something deeper, something far more unsettling. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, planting her feet on the floor, and stood up slowly. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though the fear from last night had seeped into her bones, weighing her down. Her head ached, the remnants of a sleepless night still clinging to her mind. She couldn't remember when she had fallen asleep, but it must have been long after the encounter, after the figure had disappeared, after the smile that still haunted her thoughts. But that smile, how could she forget it? She closed her eyes briefly, but the image lingered, wide, unnatural. A grotesque curve of the mouth that seemed to stretch far too wide, as if mocking her, as if it were meant to break her. Emily shook her head, trying to push the thought away, but it clung to her like a shadow. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. She went about her routine, work, errands, trying to act as if nothing had changed. But it was impossible to ignore the nagging feeling in her chest, the tightness in her stomach that wouldn't loosen. Every time she was alone, she couldn't stop looking over her shoulder. She couldn't stop glancing toward the corners of the room, half expecting to see him standing there again. The fear never fully left her, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself it was just a figment of her imagination, a part of her knew it wasn't. That night, she lay in bed again, staring into the darkness, trying to fight the rising panic in her chest. The house was quiet, too quiet. The silence was suffocating, pressing in around her. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, feel the weight of the night closing in. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her to let her guard down. And then, as though on cue, the unease began to creep in once more. The room, which had seemed so still, suddenly felt charged, as if something was present in the air, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Emily lay as still as possible, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, refusing to look toward the corner of the room. She didn't want to know. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing that figure again. But then, just as she was about to close her eyes, the sensation returned. The cold, the weight. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the pit of her stomach, a sense of dread that was both familiar and terrifying. She could no longer deny it. With a shaky breath, she turned her head ever so slightly, allowing her gaze to drift toward the corner of the room. There, standing in the same spot as before, was the man. At first, he was just a shape, a silhouette against the dimness, barely perceptible. But as her eyes adjusted to the shadows, she saw him more clearly. He was standing at the far end of the room, just like last time, but this time he was closer, much closer. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she froze. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him, but she could feel every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, to escape, to do something, anything. But she couldn't. The figure didn't move, not at first. He just stood there silently, staring at her. Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the walls felt too close, the shadows too deep. There was no way out. She was trapped. Her breath grew shallow, ragged, as panic started to claw at her chest. The figure's presence was suffocating, overwhelming. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room, leaving only the cold, suffocating grip of fear. And then, as if to confirm her worst fear, she saw him move. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A shift in the shadows, a slight bending of his form, and then before she could react, he was closer, a few feet nearer, and she could see it. The smile. It wasn't a simple benign curve of the lips. No, it was wide, too wide, and twisted in a way that was nothing short of unnatural. His face seemed to distort, stretch in ways that didn't seem possible. The smile grew impossibly large, as if it were the only thing left of his features. And it wasn't just the smile. It was the way he was looking at her. His eyes, or what should have been eyes, were dark, empty voids. Voids that seemed to swallow any light that dared come near. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly took another step forward, closing the gap between them even more. He was so close now that she could almost feel the cold emanating from him. The darkness seemed to follow him, wrapping around him like a cloak. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, swallowing the edges of the room whole. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, but her body refused to move, as if it were caught in some terrible trance, frozen in place by the sheer horror of what she was witnessing. The man didn't speak, he didn't make a sound, but the silence was deafening, and his presence, his terrible presence, filled the room in a way that was more suffocating than any physical restraint. Another step, and then another, and with each step, the smile widened. Emily could feel her pulse in her throat, her chest, the world spinning around her as her mind raced to make sense of it all. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But no matter how hard she tried to deny it, no matter how much she wanted to wake up, she couldn't escape the reality of the man in her room closing the distance between them. She could see the details now, the way his body was unnaturally still, as if he were a part of the shadows, as though he didn't belong to this world at all. And then, just when it felt like she might suffocate under the weight of her fear, he stopped, right at the foot of her bed. The smile was monstrous, grotesque, stretching across his face in a way that felt almost inhuman. It was more than a smile. It was a grin of malice, of hunger. But he still didn't move. He just stood there in the suffocating silence, his eyes locked onto hers. Emily's mind screamed for her to do something, anything, but her body was still frozen, paralyzed with fear. She couldn't look away. She couldn't look anywhere else. All she could see was him. All she could feel was him. And that smile, it seemed to stretch further, impossibly wider, and in that moment, Emily understood with a chilling clarity what he was. He wasn't just a man. He wasn't a human being. He was something else, something much darker. The light flickered once, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the light came back on, the man was gone. The days after that night felt like a blur. Emily's world was no longer her own. It felt as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, leaving her adrift in a sea of confusion and fear. She couldn't focus. Work, daily life, everything seemed distant, like she was watching it all through a thick, foggy window. It wasn't that she didn't try to move on. She did. But there was something in the back of her mind, something that refused to let go. The night after the man disappeared, Emily had tried to convince herself that it was over, that whatever had happened had been some sort of hallucination. The flickering light, the coldness, the smile. It was all part of the mind's trickery. When it was pushed too far, she reasoned. She had even gone to work the next day, done her errands, and tried to live as she had before. But it was impossible to ignore the emptiness inside her, the way her gaze kept flickering to the corners of every room she entered, expecting him to be there. The smile haunted her every waking moment. She hadn't slept well since that night. Each time she closed her eyes, the darkness behind her eyelids felt too thick, too real. The nightmares were relentless. Visions of him standing in the corner, his twisted smile stretching further and further until it consumed the room. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her body trembling with fear, and the silence of the house around her felt like an oppressive weight. The feeling of his presence lingered like a ghost she couldn't shake. And every time she looked into the mirror, she saw the same haunted expression staring back at her. The man, though gone, had left something behind, something darker than just the memory of his presence. It was as if a part of him had attached itself to her, something invisible but heavy, a parasite that fed off her fear. She knew it wasn't over. She felt it in her bones. There was something unfinished about it, a chapter that hadn't been written yet. Emily had tried to reach out to friends, to family, but how could she explain it to them? Who would believe her? How could she explain that she had seen a man in her room more than once who wasn't really there, but was still somehow real, still somehow alive in her thoughts? They would think she was losing her mind, and that thought terrified her even more, so she kept the terror inside, her mind spiraling deeper into a pit she couldn't escape. And then came the night that would change everything. It started like any other. The house was quiet. The shadows stretched long across the walls as she lay in bed, her body tense but exhausted. She hadn't slept in days, but something told her that tonight she would finally get rest. She was tired. She needed to sleep. She closed her eyes, trying to let go of the constant tension in her body, but the fear was always there, lurking at the edges of her mind. And that's when it happened again. The coldness, the weight in the air, She wasn't sure if she had fallen asleep yet or not, but she knew something was different this time. The silence felt thicker, and that same oppressive presence filled the room. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just the remnants of her fear, but the air felt alive with something else, something darker. Emily opened her eyes. He was standing there in the same place as before, the far corner of the room. But this time, there was something new. He wasn't just standing still. He was moving, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each step, each moment. The figure was taller than she remembered, his form more defined, more solid. The darkness around him was no longer just a shadow. It seemed to swirl with purpose, as if it were part of him, wrapping around him like a cloak. Her heart slammed against her ribs, panic surging through her body. She wanted to scream, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the thickness of the air. Her body was frozen, her legs like lead, her arms pinned to the bed by the weight of the fear. She couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. The man was coming closer, closer than before. The smile was there again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a simple, grotesque grin. It was wide, unnaturally wide, stretching almost impossibly across his face. It filled his entire expression, distorting his features beyond recognition. His eyes, dark and empty, stared at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was being drawn into them, pulled into a void from which she would never return. The smile grew wider still, and she thought she might faint from the sheer terror of it. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on her, the air thick with his presence. The closer he came, the darker the room became, until it felt as though there was no longer any distinction between the man and the shadows. He was part of them, and they were part of him. And then he was at the foot of her bed, standing right there, mere inches away. She could feel his coldness radiating toward her, his presence suffocating every inch of the room. His smile seemed to swallow all light, leaving only the darkness, the endless abyss that was his gaze. But just as she thought she could bear it no longer, something changed. The man's smile faltered, the darkness flickering, shifting. The air felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from it. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening. The man was fading. His form, once so solid, now seemed to dissolve, the darkness surrounding him crumbling, losing its grip on the room. Emily blinked, unsure if she was seeing it correctly, but there it was. The man, once a towering, terrifying figure, was vanishing before her eyes. The shadows that had clung to him retreated, and his smile, once so wide, began to shrink, to disappear into nothingness. In a matter of seconds, he was gone. The room, once thick with the suffocating weight of his presence, was silent again. The air was still. The darkness lifted, leaving only the pale light of the moon to illuminate the room. Emily sat there, wide-eyed, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as she tried to process what had just happened. Was it over? The thought brought no relief. There was no sense of closure, no sense of peace. She didn't feel safe. She felt empty, as though the room itself was waiting for something. And then it hit her. There was no escape. There was no running from what had happened. It wasn't just a man or a ghost or some twisted figure from her imagination. It was something much worse. It was a part of her now, a part of the darkness that she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. The phone on her nightstand rang. Emily jumped, her heart leaping into her throat as the sound broke the silence. She reached for the phone, her hand shaking, but when she looked at the screen, her breath caught. There was no name, just an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, but something inside her urged her to pick it up. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The line was silent for a long moment, and then, just as she was about to hang up, a voice spoke, a voice so familiar, so chilling, that it sent ice coursing through her veins. "I'm still here." The line went dead. Emily stared at the phone in her hand, the blood draining from her face. The voice had been his. There was no doubt about it. She had heard it clearly, the same voice that had whispered in the dark, the same voice that had been a part of the smile, a part of the nightmare. And then the phone rang again. This time, she didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. She already knew what was waiting on the other end. She had never truly been alone. The shadows still lingered, the smile still watched, and the man who was never truly gone, was waiting for the next time the darkness called to him.